Welcome to Business Focus program. Today, my guest is Madi from Embassy of Israel, Head of Trade and Economic Mission. Good morning.
Good morning. Dzień dobry.
We will have an opportunity to talk about Polish-Israeli business and economic cooperation. And I'm really curious because, you know, Israel, known as a nation of startups, startup nations, a great case study that we can all learn, especially that we live in the times where, you know, we think that technologies can help us in every aspect of our life, from business to consumers, to save maybe also and face some challenges of the climate. So I'm really curious about our discussions and where are the key sectors where actually Poles can cooperate with Israel. But before we start with all that, please tell us a few words about what's your role in the embassy and what you're aiming for.
Okay, thank you. So basically, I had the Trade and Economic Mission, as you mentioned. And what we do at the Trade Mission is basically focus on the bilateral trade between Poland and Israel, nurture it, and try to make business connections between both sides. So a lot of Israelis or Israeli companies are interested very much in working with Polish companies, finding their partner here, working in the Polish market in terms of technologies, but also in terms of consumer products, basically. So what we try to do is connect them, and we do that in few ways. We organize business events. During the Corona times, we had a lot of online webinars, online events, which was in our favor because we managed to bring high-rank officials and high-rank companies or representatives of the companies to participate in the events, which otherwise would have been too busy to join us personally. And we do so by sending trade missions to Israel and from Israel. So, for example, in the next upcoming months, we have 2 business delegations from Poland to Israel, one in health tech, one in cybersecurity, and basically that's what we do. We try to connect also Israeli officials and Polish officials. For example, in the field of cybersecurity, we had in 2019 signing on an MOU for cyber cooperation. So we have these talks on an ongoing basis. And in general, you know, bringing closer relations between business people from Poland and Israel.
Okay, so the sectors that you mentioned, they used to be the sectors of the future, but the future is now. So let's take a look on the figures to maybe if you can bring us several figures in terms of the business and investment climate between Poland and Israel, so we get the base.
So I would say the bilateral trade between Poland and Israel is in 3 layers. So one is the consumer products, one is investments, and one is services, of course. On the level of consumer products, including services, we had a total of $1.5 billion USD in 2021, which is around 22% rise as opposed to 2020. So despite the corona, it continued to grow, which is a good thing. But of course, I'm optimistic, but I would like it to grow even more. When we look at the analysis of the consumer products, we see that from Poland to Israel, we're talking about mainly agricultural products, which is around 1/3 of the total trade, around 33%. We are talking about machinery and electromechanic products, devices. We are also talking about transport equipment and around 7% of chemicals. Whereas when we look at the Israeli side to Poland, we see that chemicals, for example, as opposed to 7%, we're talking about 17%, which also includes pharmaceuticals, so any medicines and so on. But the main sector is actually machinery, which is around 1/4, around 24%. We're talking about rubber and plastic, optical and medical devices, and some agriculture, which is only 10%. But when we look at that, we see that it's mainly citrus fruits, mango, avocado, dates. So they're really chubby, juicy, very sweet dates. So mainly things that grow in the climate of Israel. When we go to the services, we're actually looking at quite similar numbers, around 20 million USD for each side. But on the level of Poland to Israel, we are looking at consuming more IT services when it comes to development, technical support, and so on. But from Israel to Poland, we're talking about software and technologies. And then last but not least, the investments. So there we see actually the positive scale towards the Israeli part. We're talking about 3.5 to 5.5 billion USD of investments in Poland, led by Israeli companies in various sectors. For example, real estate like Ronson, Atrium, solar energy, for example, Dural, Elmore Energy, which I actually participated in the opening of a solar farm last month. There is Energix for wind farms. Also, we had an opening of a wind farm last month. So in various other sectors. And of course, let's not forget Superfarm and Teva that have their production here and, well, have their branches as well.
Well, so many sectors. Let's maybe focus on a few of them, which are like the key sectors. And maybe let's start with the agriculture that you mentioned, because I think that's quite interesting example. And it shows how much has changed over the years, right? Because in the beginning, you mentioned yourself that it was like pure export. And now it's more like know-how and technology. So if you could, because of course also Israel is known as, making fantastic results almost on the desert, right? And now I'm looking at the Poland. I'm looking on the challenges of the climate, and I think that with what we have still in Poland, when we would implement the right technologies and the right know-how, we can really also grow our base of the agriculture as a hub, even European hub maybe.
True. So on the agricultural cooperation, I would mention that, as we discussed before, Israel, when it was just established on 48, we had around 50% of agricultural products exported, citrus fruits and so on. And as we move forward till now, we are more focused on the technological level of our agriculture. As you said, growing plants and growing fruits and vegetables in the desert. So the south of Israel is known for the scarcity of water, and definitely a lot of technologies came from the need that we saw, so we can well live. So drip irrigation, for example, by Netafim, a lot of other technologies that address drought can be really good for Poland in terms of using the scarce resources of water. But also manage the waters that we have right now in a more better and efficient way. So for that reason, for example, even during the Corona, we hosted a virtual tour of Israeli companies showing their crops, their basically, the fields that they have their technologies applied in. And it was magnificent to see. There was a lot of interest. There were around 200 participants online.
But it was like the local authorities or some business partners?
Local authorities, some business partners, even research organizations, a lot of wide spectrum of organizations. And Israeli companies that showed their technologies and how they helped Israel become better in agriculture.
So actually those companies are targeting Poland and they see the potential here to grow, and you are encouraging and showing them this potential.
Yes. In fact, we have one of the regions visiting Israel, hopefully till the end of the year, to learn more about the abilities that Israel has in Agritech and meet some Israeli companies in the field of agriculture, of optimization of crops, handling drought, and everything related basically to have better agricultural produce. So it should be interesting.
So let's move on to another sector which is also connected to the better efficiency and maybe also for the sake of our world, which is cybersecurity, maybe later, circular economy.
Yes.
So I know that you also tackle this one, and you have also quite a big potential to contribute to the Polish development in this area.
Yes, definitely. I definitely see that one of the main sectors that could be great potential for cooperation between Poles and Israelis. We recently hosted an event on sustainability and circular economy We had a lot of companies that are dealing with biodegradable packaging, for example, recycling plastic to its raw material so you can reuse it again and again, which helps lower the plastic waste. And a lot of other companies that can help in all the components of the circularity and being more sustainable. Now, we hosted Allegro, Coca-Cola, and Deloitte on this event, and I think the conversation and the discussion was very interesting because we see that on the shorter term, it gives a lot of challenges to the companies. We see that it would be a high cost on the shorter term, but when we look on the longer term and when we put the sake of our planet in solving these issues, then we see that it's definitely worthwhile. We see that we can develop a more sustainable ecosystem, helping the planet be better, helping our whole circularity process, let's say. And yeah, that definitely is one of the sectors that would be a good potential between Israelis and Poles.
Mm-hmm. So the offer from the Israeli company would be more like sharing know-how, sharing technologies, or you mean about the producers that could actually seeing that this trend is also picked up by the consumers, it's just basically entering the Polish market?
So I would say it can go on different layers. Mm-hmm. It can be on the advisory level, because a lot of Israelis invest in research and development to have a more sustainable ecosystem. So that's one. But it can definitely be, and mainly can be, on the level of technologies. Mm-hmm. Because there are a lot of technologies that are addressing current challenges, but also challenges that we have in Israel. For example, what we discussed earlier, the scarcity of water, knowing how to use the resources so we're never lacking of them is actually quite important when we're talking about circularity and protecting the planet. So I definitely see a lot of technologies that can be of help to the Polish ecosystem. And when it comes to, for example, sustainability in terms of e-commerce, let's say, just one example, it can be on a wide range from sustainable packaging so that you can all the time recycle and get back to circularity, but it can also be to more efficient processes, to more automized operations that can help lower, for example, the energy used, and then everything related to that when it comes to affecting our planet.
Mm-hmm. So that's interesting because there is a recent report about e-commerce that actually shows that, of course, Poland is growing in this regard, and not only for the domestic demand, but also on the wider European scale. So let's name Poland as becoming a European hub for logistics. But what is interesting is that when looking at the location in Poland, it's not only the location within Poland, but it's also if I locate there my operations, my warehouse or whatever, whether there will be people to work. So it also proves that with the shortage of workers, the technologies can also jump in here and help to facilitate all the processes, because there is more and more of those processes and people want everything faster and faster and closer to their home. So there is a lot of things in the same time happening, right?
True. And I think on that end, the COVID-19 outbreak sort of made it faster to move towards automation, to more digitalized operations. So I would give one example of one Israeli company called 1M Robotics that actually offers automized complete store that does not need any human hand. So it's completely automized and that does the whole process of the purchase from A to Z. Mm-hmm. So it would pick the whole products that you mentioned in your order. It would package it, prepare the package, and also on a sustainable base. And then it would just hand it out to you, just ready for use. So I think that also relates to Q-commerce, to future stores in general in e-commerce, where we see more automized operations, more AI use, more automation of a lot of processes, but also the whole purchase process.
That's interesting. So let's maybe now move to the cybersecurity, also technologies, but a little bit different aspect. And of course, COVID and now the war in Ukraine are the topics that make cybersecurity even more important. So what's your contribution in this regard? And you already mentioned that there are some projects in progress.
True. I think here, and I'm not going to be modest, Israel is one of the top leaders in the world in terms of cybersecurity. We have a lot of companies that are dealing with cybersecurity, around 600 each year. So there's a wide pool of cybersecurity solutions. I think on this level, Poland also knows and acknowledges the know-how and the understanding of cybersecurity in Israel. So dealing with technologies is also something that could be great potential for cooperation. We had a lot of interest, especially as you mentioned during the recent events. With the COVID-19, with the rise of phishing and malicious operations and cyber attacks, and definitely with the war in Ukraine, where we saw cyber warfare rising and continuing to rise, basically. So it's definitely something that is worth mentioning. And I would get back to the fact that we have an MOU on cyber cooperation. So now more than ever is definitely needed, so we can share experiences, share know-how, methodologies, and everything related to how you tackle these problems. So we can learn from each other, but also try to implement technologies between both sides.
But when you talk about this type of cooperation, you also see the potential in Israeli companies entering the Polish market, because obviously we see it in many other in the wide IT sector, yes, that a lot of international companies are implementing their operations here in Poland because they see the talent pool here in actually all cities, not only Warsaw, but it's Poznań, it's even Bydgoszcz, it's Krakow, Katowice. So I'm wondering whether you also see this area for cooperation.
Yeah, I think what Israelis see in Poland is very high-skilled human resources and relatively lower cost of work, of labor. So that's definitely something that is worth mentioning. And when it comes to cooperation, specifically when it comes to cybersecurity, there are a lot of development projects and research projects that can be combined between both sides. So both sides bring their expertise and their experience in the field to create a better product. So there are a lot of R&D projects, for example, that is worth mentioning, not only in cybersecurity, in a lot of other sectors that could be relevant for such cooperation. And I definitely encourage anyone interested from both sides to approach us, and we will help finding the right partner on the other side, or refer to other partners that can help with that.
Because several times you mentioned R&D, and do you also work with the universities in Poland, or?
Well, we work with the universities in Poland in terms of trying to push forward joint projects between Israeli companies and Polish companies. On our side, on the Israeli side, we have the Innovation Authority that deals with such projects. And on the Polish side, we have NCBR, which, by the way, it's a perfect opportunity to mention that the deadline to apply for joint cooperation between Polish-Israeli companies is towards the end of this month. So anyone interested, this is your chance. We can help you find your partner at the other side. And it's definitely worthwhile because it's eventually the EU funds that is dedicated to such projects and that can help push our cooperation even further.
But is it in some particular sector or open?
It's quite open, but there are some sectors that each side is focusing on. Health tech is one of them, and other sectors, for example, Industry 4.0, so advanced manufacturing, automation, as we mentioned before. So there is quite a wide range of sectors, and depending on the companies, basically, and the type of partner that they are looking for in the other side, we can help make the connections, and then hopefully have more joint cooperations on this end.
You started a little bit talking about the perception of Poland in terms of the labor market, how Poland is perceived by the Israel. But any other aspects that you think that maybe Israel see in Poland, and maybe something that is misunderstood? Do actually Israeli companies have a good perception of Poland, as you are being here for several years already?
Yes, actually, 3 years. Towards the end of this year, I celebrate my anniversary. So I would say during these years, and from my experience, as I realize it, I would call it the 3 T's that Poles and Israelis need to have in order to establish successful business cooperation. One is tolerance, basically. So letting go of any prejudice that each side might have of the other one, and just being open, basically, coming open to the meeting, coming open to share ideas, to share know-how, to inspire and be inspired. The second is trust. Without trust, you cannot build any kind of relationship. So I think trusting that both sides join together for the sake of having a good business, successful business, is definitely something that is super important to start such cooperation. And the third is talent. So without a common ground to work, without some innovation involved, you have nothing, basically. So it's the start of a common working ground for both sides. So yeah, 3 T's is very interesting
nice.
for both sides.
I will have to remember this. So also on the other way around, you mentioned innovations, and Poland. I mean, innovation. We talk about innovations. If we take a look at the figures, there is no big changes within several years. So I'm wondering maybe what we could learn from Israel in this regard. To really embrace these innovations, these technologies?
That's a very excellent question, and a question I like to answer.
Fantastic.
So I'll give you an excellent answer as well. I think the main point that can be learned from the Israeli ecosystem or the startup nation is to not be afraid to fail, or not be afraid to mess up. Yeah, you fail, you try again. You get up and you try again. You make it better. You talk to some experts. You go into more research. You try to retrack all your points or your steps to make it even better the next time. And I think what the Israeli ecosystem does is actually provide that support. So if you're falling, you have a safety net. You have someone that's supporting you. One, you have the government. Because, for example, I belong to the Ministry of Economy and Industry, and the ministry offers some grants to Israeli companies that are interested in working abroad, whether it's on the marketing level, whether it's on the research level, research and development, and so on. I mentioned earlier the Innovation Authority also gives some grants. And there they tell you, if you fail, it's okay, we're not going to charge you. But if you succeed, pay us some amount of the success, basically, of the profit.
That's a kind of success fee, okay.
Exactly. But if you fail, nobody is taking any money of you. So you have this safety net, and it just encourages you to try more and get to that idea that will become the next unicorn.
So at the end of the day, it's very business and, let's say, entrepreneurial approach.
Definitely.
Not like startup, like separate to business, because that's what I'm sometimes when I'm looking at the Polish market, I think that, at the end of the day, startup has to turn into the business or maybe make some modification and become a bigger business, right?
True. But then the first steps or from startup to a business, this is the most difficult part.
Of course.
And for this part, Israel gives you the support. So I think that is definitely something that is worth learning from the Israeli ecosystem. If such approach would be implemented, I think it would help a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of startups to grow, and then stand on their own feet, and then go to funding rounds and so on. So I think it's definitely one of the main factors of the startup ecosystem.
But if you have this such a big contribution from the government in this ecosystem, does it mean that also the government, let's say, stream the attention of, let's say, the sector where these innovations are created in some areas where it's actually strategic for the development of the country, and whether they see the potential for exports or some bigger cooperation international?
Another great question. It actually does. Sometimes there's focus on some areas. For example, it's no surprise that during the corona, more cybersecurity companies were established and more health tech companies were established. And in fact, in 2021 and even 2020, just the beginning of the outbreak, there were a lot of investments put into health tech companies, for example, and at a later stage, even in cybersecurity companies. So there's definitely, the main focus points of, let's say, the Innovation Authority and other governmental organizations that are supporting the startup ecosystem. But eventually, good technology is worth investing in. Yeah. So regardless of the sector, it is definitely worth putting some money on it to see how it develops and makes the world slightly a better place.
But do you think just this do not be afraid to fail, is it more like the attitude, or it's more related to the fact that it's money behind it and you have also this financial safety?
I think it's more about the attitude.
Attitude first.
In general, yeah, for sure. Because I think the main factor that I would say I noticed some difference between Polish and Israeli ecosystems is the fact that Israelis are much more informal. So there isn't this, fear of asking questions and asking again to get to the point and to get to the main idea, to understand every pillar of it. Whereas on the Polish side, there is slightly some hesitation to ask questions. So that's why I mentioned openness would be a really good and beneficial thing for both sides to discuss openly.
So maybe one more question would be about the potential for the Polish companies on the Israeli market.
I would say that the main potential for Polish companies in Israel is in the field of consumer products. I believe that anything that would contribute to more competition, better consumer prices, can do a great deal to the citizens of Israel. For example, in the fields of cosmetics, of foodstuff, of even more machinery and electric devices, Polish machinery and electric devices, can do very good to the market, to the Israeli market, where the prices are constantly higher. And it's definitely predominantly a problem for Israeli citizens fighting the cost of living. So I would say that for Polish companies, it would be very much beneficial to come with their products and add more competition to the market. I would add also that Zhaja, for example, the Polish cosmetics company, just recently launched their products in stores in Israel. And trust me, there's quite the market for that. So people were very much excited for that. So I believe more products like that would definitely do good. And I definitely encourage any Polish companies to approach us. And I would be happy to help on that end as well.
And do you see more Polish companies? Or we have to wait for several success of the companies like Zhaja, and then we'll see more?
Well, what I can share, is what's already in the media. Yeah. But there are definitely more Polish companies interested in entering the market. And we would be happy to help them as well.
Well, and I think that's a great one-liner to end our discussion, because we have to finish. But I think that openness and a good attitudes is the beginning of everything. And then also trust, as you said.
True.
A key thing for a good relation, also business relation. Thank you very much for the discussion. It was a pleasure to have you here in the studio.
Pleasure is mine. Thank you.